I want to talk to anybody who has had a birthday within the last 12 months. Think very carefully. If you had a birthday within the last 12 months, you say, of course I have. Do you know anybody who has not had a birthday in the last 12 months? No, I don't. So in other words, everybody has birthdays every year. That's true. If you've had a birthday during the last 12 months, would you say that you are now 1 year older than you were 12 months ago? You say, yes, of course I am. Have you ever thought about it? If you are getting relentlessly older year after year after year, you must be aging. In fact, the whole world seems to be aging. Now, this subject of aging, of course, is a subject we don't usually bring up in polite company, but we're all friends together, so let me talk to you about this whole business of aging. Do you remember reading about, or perhaps you were even alive at the time, you remember at the end of the Second World War, there were many people came back from the war, and their families were happy to see them, and we know how happy many of them were to be seen back home, because 9 months later, little children began to appear in large numbers. In fact, there's such large numbers that the whole new generation was called the baby boom generation. And that was abbreviated to boomers. The boomers became a whole generation on their own. They were able to look back and see that we just survived the Second World War, which came far too soon after the First World War. The First World War, we were told, was the war to end all wars. Well, that went down the drain as soon as the Second World War started. And the result was that people born after the Second World War looked at the immediate history of which they were aware and decided enough is enough. We've got to have a change. And so the boomers committed themselves to change, and they started changing everything. And our culture and our societies began to have a radical facelift or uplift. Eventually the boomers married and they had children. And the people who were born to them were called the busters. Now, because they had been raised by people who were committed to changing everything, quite obviously these young people felt that their job was to change what the boomers had already changed. And so now we began to experience all kinds of change. Well, as time went on, the other generations came along, and one generation after another, we discovered to our amazement, our aging. The boomers, for instance, are turning into their 70s. The Generation X people, they're aging too. And even the millennials, the youngest generation, are in their 30s now. In other words, aging is an issue. Now, when we think about age, if we think about age and aging at all, very often it's something we don't want to ponder very much. I say that some people are working very hard to delay aging. My wife gets cream that she says helps her skin, and it's called oil of Olay. I call it oil of delay, because there seems to be a tremendous concern that if we are aging, we don't want to look as if we're aging. We don't want to feel as if we're aging. We want to delay this relentless progress. Some people don't delay it, they try to deny it. Some people, they just defy it. They take this aging thing on as an enemy, and they get into all kinds of bizarre, often self-destructive behavior. But you can delay it, you can defy it, you can deny it, but I want you to know something. It will define you in the end. And I hate to tell you this, but it happens to be true. Aging will defeat you, finally. Now then, that's enough about outlining the obvious. Everybody is aging. We don't always want to think about it. We don't always want to talk about it. I would say that aging is an undeniable reality. And the sooner we face up to it, I believe, the better. Now, do you remember Socrates, the Greek philosopher? I understand, I didn't know him personally. He was slightly before my time. Said this: the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, if you don't take life seriously, if you don't look into it very, very carefully, very often you may be living very, very superficially indeed. Now, if that's true, and aging is an integral part of living, if the unexamined life is not worth living, if we haven't examined aging, perhaps we haven't started examining our lives. There's a biblical verse that I want to draw to your attention. It's found in Psalm 90, and it's verse 12. And this is what it says: teach us to number our days, that we might apply our hearts to wisdom. What does teach us to number our days mean? Well, it means, first of all, we recognize, as we often say colloquially, our days are numbered. I was thinking about this the other day. I'm 86 years of age. There's been 365 days in every one of the years that I've lived. If you want to do the math, I don't, but if you want to do the math, multiply 365 by 86, and you'll come up with a number that is tens of thousands. And I say to myself, that's what I've lived. What in the world have I done with it? This is what I mean by teach us to number our days. Look very, very seriously into this whole business of living. And so if aging is an undeniable reality, I want to submit to you, secondly, that aging is an unexamined phenomenon. Aging is an unexamined phenomenon. But according to Scripture, we need to turn to the Lord. We need to say, Lord, help me to look realistically into the fact that my days are numbered and I'm living them at a relentless pace, and I need to look very, very carefully into what it means that I am actually aging. Now, of course, the good rule of biblical study is that we examine a verse in its context. In fact, I often say, if you take a text out of its context, you're left with a con. We're not interested in conning people. And so when we look at this verse, Psalm 90, verse 12, we've got to realize that it doesn't just suddenly pop out and be a verse on its own. It fits into the whole psalm. And when we do look at it as a whole psalm and find this verse in its context, we'll find out why it is that the psalmist is suddenly saying, wow, I need to be examining my life. I need to be looking very, very carefully into this whole business of aging. Why does he do that? Well, let me just introduce one or two things for you as far as Psalm 90 is concerned. This is how it starts out. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Or in actual fact, it simply says you are. You exist. How does God exist? From everlasting to everlasting. Now, have you ever tried to figure out what that looks like or what it means? From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Well, think of time as much as you can. Think of your span of life as much as you can. And then think of human history as much as you've learned it. And then think of all the places you've traveled to and been able to see the relics of former cultures, perhaps. And then go back as far as you possibly can in your imagination, and then realize that you haven't begun to touch the beginnings of the end of the extremities of eternity. This is what it says about God. In an eternity that is beyond our comprehension, God existed. But then he says from eternity to eternity. If it is possible for us to try to imagine a bygone eternity, then we should add to that trying to imagine a coming eternity. Now this is beyond our comprehension. We can't even have the categories in which to think of such a thing. And yet one thing we are told, that God is God. Not that God was God and God will be God, but in a bygone eternity, he is in the state of continuous existence, and in a coming eternity, he will still be in a state of continuous existence, and nothing will have changed, and he has been the dwelling place for those who trust in him from generation to generation to generation to generation. Now, it's very important we notice this, because this is the context in which the psalmist begins to say, wow, the more I think about God being from everlasting to everlasting, I look at myself and I say, oh, teach me to number my days. What is my life in comparison to who God is? What am I in the context of who God is? Now, that's a very, very healthy corrective. If we don't want to think about aging, we should. But if we start thinking about aging, we should start thinking about the fact that God is the eternal God who has given us a tiny little slice of something that he invented called time. And he gives us this little piece of time. And he tells us to invest in it. Now, the next thing that comes up in this Psalm 90, having talked about the fact that God is eternal, is this, and it's a surprise. You turn men back to dust, saying, return to dust, O sons of men. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has gone by, or like a watch in the night. You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it is dry and withered. Wow. So immediately the psalmist says, the more I think of God and his eternal nature, and I put myself in the context of the eternal God, I begin to realize how finite I am. He is infinite. I am finite. He is unlimited. I am limited by time and space. Oh Lord, teach me to number my days. But not only am I finite, he goes on to say that men are swept away into death. He goes on to say that in actual fact, after we've been swept away into death, our bodies return to the dust. And we're reminded not only are we finite, we're reminded that we are frail as well. But then he gets into an explanation of this phenomenon, of what it means to be finite and what it means to be frail, in contrast to the eternal God. And he explains how we got to be in this condition. It says in verse 7, we are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. The length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have the strength, yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass. What is he saying now? Well, actually, what he is saying is there is a reason that we are finite and frail. And that reason is we are fallen. We are fallen. He begins to talk about God, the eternal God, looking at we human beings and being displeased with who we are and what we're doing. When God created man in the first place, he created man to live in union with himself. And he told us how to live in union with him, for us to enjoy God and for God to enjoy us. And it was very simple, it was very straightforward. He said, I am going to be your God and I will provide all you need for fullness of life. In response to that fullness of life that I promised man, God said, I expect you to respond in loving, trusting obedience. That was the covenant. That was the basis. That was the way it was going to work. Now, you cannot impose love on people. You have to give them the opportunity to choose to love. And if you're going to give people the opportunity to choose to love, then you've got to give them alternatives of choice. You cannot have a choice with only one option. And so God says, now here's how it goes. You've got the whole of created order to enjoy. There's just one part of it you're not to touch. It's a test. Just don't touch it. But then he did say this, but if you do move into that forbidden area, take that forbidden fruit, the day you do, you'll die. And of course, the sad history of humanity is that we did rebel against God. We did renege on the relationship that we were intended to enjoy with him. And the indignation of God, the wrath of God was imposed on humanity, and a curse is what we live with. And the curse, of course, is this, that we are fallen, as well as being frail, as well as being finite. And the result of our fallenness is that we have found ourselves estranged from God, who is the source of life. Now, if we are estranged from the source of life, then we will be like all kinds of wonderful pieces of equipment, like the camera I'm talking into, the bright lights that are shining upon me, the microphone into which I'm speaking. But all these things would be dead if the electrical current was suddenly cut off. That's what happened to the human race. When we rebelled against God, we separated ourselves from the source of life. And the energy went, the power went, the desire went. The enablement of a relationship with God went. And we were separated from the source of life, and to be separated from the source of life is described by a very simple, awful word we don't want to consider either, death. And that's what the psalmist is saying. He is saying, God is eternal. We are finite. We are frail. We are fallen. We've come under the judgment of God. Oh God, if that is true, teach us to number our days. But he goes a step further. He says that the curse placed upon mankind by God in his judgment was death. But this is a process, and the process of death is called dying. And in actual fact, when a human being is born into the world, not only do they start aging from day one, there's a sense in which they start dying from day one. And if we are going to think clearly about aging, what we've got to think clearly about is this, that we are before God frail and finite and fallen. We come under God's judgment, and the judgment is that we experience aging, we experience dying, we experience death itself, and Scripture is very, very graphic, and we know it is absolutely true. After death, our bodies return to the dust. Teach us to number our days, says the psalmist. In other words, let's get serious about this business of living, because we recognize that if we as human beings are in the process of living, we have got to deal with our frailty, we've got to deal with our finitude, and we've got to deal with our fallenness. And how do we start dealing with that? Well, we start dealing with that by making absolutely certain that we are in tune with the God from whom we come, to whom we are accountable, through whom we live. And that's where the psalm goes next. For this is what the psalmist says: to teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Then immediately he tells us how we start gaining a heart of wisdom. We ask God not to deal with us on the basis of our deserts. We ask Him not simply to banish us from His presence. We ask Him to relent. We ask Him to turn to us in love and in compassion. In fact, it says quite simply, have compassion on your servants. Have you ever asked God, as you thought seriously about your life and your aging and your finiteness and your fallenness, etc., and your frailty that is demonstrating itself in your aging body? Have you ever thought to sit down and think very, very seriously about the God from whom you come, through whom you live, to whom you're accountable? Have you ever sat down and asked yourself, how would I relate to Him? Can I go to Him and say, hey, look at me, this is what I've been, this is what you got? Or am I going to go to Him humbly and repentantly and say, Lord, I need a dramatic change in my life, for I've erred and strayed from your ways, and I ask you to be gracious to me. I ask you to be compassionate to me. I ask you to take me and forgive me and renew me and set my life on a new track. And that's how this psalm ends. I'm so glad about that, because it's quite a downer so far. But now the end of the psalm goes like this. Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. And then it gets very positive indeed. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children, and may the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Where does it go? After we have very, very carefully numbered our days in the light of our frailty and fallenness, etc., and we have asked God to be gracious and to deal with us in compassion and forgiveness and grace, and we've come into a new relationship with Him, we find He is going to renew us with joy, with purpose, and we are going to come before Him and saying, Lord, in the light of the fact that my days are numbered and they are rapidly going away, would you establish the work of my hands? Would you look at what I'm going to do with my life? Would you get a hold of the way I'm going about my life and get a hold of me? And Lord, would you establish the life that I live from this time on? I would suggest to you that if that is the prayer that we make, there's a third thing that we can remember concerning ages. First of all, aging is an undeniable reality. Secondly, aging is an unexplored phenomenon. But finally, aging is an unheralded opportunity. It's an unheralded opportunity where we don't bemoan the fact that we're aging, but that we say the older we get, the closer we are to being in His presence. But in the interim, we are going to have the joy of His compassionate love and grace upon our lives, and having the sense that we have purpose in what we're doing, and we're saying as we live a day at a time, Lord, take this day, establish the work of my hands, and do in me and through me that which pleases Him and blesses humanity. Improving with age is the theme of these talks, and I trust that that prepares the way for us to think in terms of realistically evaluating our lives in the light of aging. God bless you.